So this talk, I didn't make this talk for this session, but it's one that I wrote for a keynote for PyData Berlin. But it covers, there's a core section in there that I think is something that I've only recently come to understand about what it is I find to be so special about our PyData sort of community. And so it's in the middle of a section on this talk about rethinking open source. How many of you have been using open source for some time and are reasonably conversant with the idea of open source? No, Michael, all right. I think actually it's high time for us to rethink what open source really is, or what are some of its most essential elements, in order to be able to carry it forward into a cloud future. So these are topics that we all see and hear about, right, in the open source community. There's burnout. There's many things people try to do with donations. There's the dip jar thing down on the NumFOCUS table. And of course, there's the question of exploitation, where cloud companies are able to use all this open source software. They might give some back, actually. They might actually be able to, for instance, I think in the case of Amazon's Mongo service, like I think they might have more devs on it than Mongo has on their enterprise offering. And that's okay, I guess, or is it? You know, and if it's not okay, what's the principle? What are the underlying principles that we say that's actually not okay, or something has been lost in that process? And then, of course, in response, I don't know how many people here have seen this, but some of these companies have adopted new licenses for their open source software. So they're not really what we would consider in the traditional open source kind of family of things. So, you know, it makes me sad, sad emoji. And so in order to go through all the slides I have on this, we have to go ludicrous speed. So I'm going to talk a little fast, but first topic is open source. So some people, you know, are familiar with this debate of, is it open? Does open mean free? And if it's free, is it free beer, free speech, right? Does open mean I can read the source code? Well, how many of you use SciPy? How many people here have used SciPy? How many of you ever read the SciPy source code, the entirety of it? The entirety of it, right? Even 50% of it, right? I would challenge anyone to read 50% of it, because if you go and you look at it, that's a crap ton of code, and there's 94 lines of MATLAB for whatever reason. Well, you know, Travis is not here, but we'd ask him if he were here what that is all about. But the point is, we're kidding ourselves if we say open means I can read the code. Because when you read the code is when something breaks, and you're like, is it me or is it the library, right? But at that point, that's only when it breaks. If it works, you're never reading the code, right? So it does kind of mean free, and I always have the option, I reserve the option to go and look at what's broken in it if I do something funky with it. Does open mean it's open to new contributions, right? Like, if you have a problem, you can fix your problem. Well, thanks. I could have done that anyway. Like, what's the thing here? Because just because it's open source doesn't mean that they're going to accept my changes. And in fact, they may see my changes and say, oh yeah, you know what? We don't want to do that. Our library should never do that. That's a screwed up use case. Never. And you're like, whoa, it was actually okay for a little bit, right? So that can happen too. Or does it mean that you're actually open to ideas? Because open to PR is not the same as open to ideas, right? And so the point of this is just to get people thinking a little bit, get some juices flowing early in the morning about the idea that open source is not just about licenses. It's actually, for me, it's about empowering communities and empowering people to innovate. So it actually has a really wonderful way of aligning the users and the developers, right? The innovators who are making things, they get instant feedback from people. Doesn't mean they're going to take all their feedback, but they can have a route, a venue for feedback. So it's really important, you know, there's so much discussion on open source. I don't see many people talking about this aspect of it. Because even on Hacker News, which is of course a very narrow slice of the world, but on Hacker News, on Reddit, wherever else, it comes down to a lot of times, is it licenses? Well, if the OSI has approved this license, then I guess it's open source. No, that's not necessarily, I mean, that's technically true, but does it really achieve what we want to achieve with this? And the reason why I think this is a really important thing for us to think about is because I think the Python community, the open source stuff we do here, we have the ability to actually take these principles and move them forward in a different way. So the thing that's interesting is that everyone should keep in mind is that code actually is about APIs, right? There's fewer and fewer projects that are just giant monolithic things. Even TensorFlow, right, which is a giant monolith from, it was dropped as a giant code drop from Google. It's got a ton of internal APIs, a ton of extension APIs. And what, unfortunately, this is a kind of a weird point, but younger devs I don't think, remember the days of Microsoft when we had to pay for libraries and SDKs. You had to pay, like, it cost $5,000, $10,000 to have access to all of the SDKs to develop everything on Windows. That's what it used to look like. We've gone through a period where the web took over everything, and now people just use cloud services. But if you are chained to using certain APIs on the cloud service, you're essentially getting nickel and dimed. It's a death by a thousand cuts of the exact same model, right? It doesn't matter. You can use a pile of open source from this GitHub repo and that repo and everything else. If to actually make your thing work at all, you're out $200 a month to Amazon, if that's the only way you could possibly do it, right? So you're still, the chains, it's like an invisible fence versus like hard iron shackles to the wall of Microsoft and Oracle, but it's still a thing. So this last point is something that people should definitely be aware of. Because code and common pieces of code turn into APIs, like the Pandas API and whatnot, commercial players can use fake open source, what I call faux open source. They can establish these standards that benefit only their platform. And so it's hard for someone to make a standard for like of an Amazon or a Google or an Oracle to make a standard that only runs on their thing. Because people are like, well, if I use that, then if I speak that language, if I put that little feature set in my brain, then I'm only ever able to think on Oracle's cloud or on Amazon's various things. But if they take one that already exists and they slot in underneath it something that's compatible, and it's like, whoa, it's the stuff I already know how to do, and now it's just really convenient to do over here, and eventually it expands. And what Microsoft used to call the strategy was the embrace, extend, extinguish strategy. And that's essentially what's happening to the open source APIs that we've established in the PyData space. In fact, when Travis, yesterday he was whinging a little bit about TensorFlow. The fact that they're going and trying to replace certain kinds of NumPy APIs without working with the NumPy community, that's an element of this. And it's not that they're trying to actively be evil. They're just corporations being corporate. They have a technology strategy. They need to get things done. Their developers, engineers, program managers have KPIs they need to hit by the quarter, and that's just what they're going to do. Why would they slow down for the community to sit there and argue on a mailing list about some other stuff over here, right? So it's not that there's a manifest evil, like Dr. Evil sitting there saying we will destroy all open source. It's, hey, this is cool. There's a bunch of free users here. We just match this API, build more stuff, and they'll use our stuff, and now I get bonused, right? It's a lot of people making short-term decisions with no regard to the thing that they're now destroying. So it's the accidental extend and extinguish that's happening. So in response, the immune response from certain other players has been, pretty immediate. But when they do this, the thing to be aware of, what I'm talking about, this extend and extinguish about open APIs, is not the same as Mongo and Redis fighting against Amazon. In the case of Redis, in the case of, and I have a lot of respect for the engineers and the businesses and everything, but what they have is a business model problem. It's not an open source problem. Because in both these cases, 99% of the source code, even though it was open source, it was written by the people directly employed by those companies. Right? The source code is open sourced as a business loss leader decision, and that's a business model problem. You delivered something as a loss leader, Amazon took it and said, thank you, we're going to take this community and run with it. You have a business model problem. That's not a general challenge to open source. But this stuff over here, this hijacking of open communities, that is a problem for open source. These are two different kinds of things. And the way I see this, the way I would articulate this very succinctly, is that stable open APIs are actually a commons. They're a very valuable thing. So in economic theory, we talk about commons, we talk about utilities. It's very valuable. It's basically what they call a Schelling point or something else like that. Basically, this idea that we're all better if we work together here, rather than each of us trying to build every single thing up from the ground up ourselves. It's just a much more efficient use of resources. So it's a market between the users, the maintainers, and the innovators. And those are three different classes. The maintainers are there to make sure that the thing keeps working and that it avoids bit rot and slowly evolve it. Innovators take it and make it do something radically different, do something really great. But they're able to be accelerated in that. They don't have to go from ground to 30,000 feet. They can start 20,000 feet and go to 30,000 feet. And that's really cool. So it's a different set of concerns there. And all of these are about preserving choice for the user. So the user can say, I'm going to use what's here today, and I'm going to keep using it for 5 years. And if no one else is around to maintain it, I can go and hire consultants in. I can hire my own developers to go maintain it because I have access to all the source code. It's all right there. But if the user says, hey, you know what? I want to be bleeding edge, super bleeding edge. I want the latest release even before it's released. I can do that too. it gives a lot of choice to different users and to innovators. It's wonderful. This is a tremendous, significant value for human society that we can do this. So then if there is this concept of something is not just open or just closed, there's scales of openness, right? If it's open but the only developers in the world that can answer questions on it work at one company, then it's kind of open but kind of not. If it's open but there's no one maintaining it, but everyone uses it, then it's also kind of open, and if it ever breaks, a lot of resources will flood in to fix it, like OpenSSL, right? But that's a different kind of open. So this concept of non-binary openness is sort of something I put up there, but I think it's important for everyone to think about open source in a very intentional way and not just say, is this open source, is it not? But rather think about what aspects of this are actually open, what is it that I care about when I engage with this open source thing? And I would say that a lot of people in our community, they use it, well, I'll get to that in the next little bit, but from a material like business decision process point of view, these are the things that I would say matter to a business, right? As I'm thinking about, should I use this piece of software, take a dependency on it for my project, it's around these kinds of things. So let's talk about software then, because this is all open source, and almost everything I talk about here applies not just, well, this applies to software, but many other things I talked about in this section apply to open source hardware templates, open source many kinds of things. But if we talk about open software itself, open source software, there's a point that sometimes is missed by people because we all know that Linux is open source, Emacs is open source, Vim, Docker, the Apache web server, all of these things are open source. And these are august pieces of open source software from the 90s. They've been around for a very long time, and people, of course, don't really question their use of these things at this point. And usually they were built by devs to scratch dev itches, and usually they're designed to solve like infrastructure software kinds of things. So a line at Microsoft about open source used to be that open source solves well-known problems, right? I need a text editor. I'm Richard Stallman, I will make my own. I need an extensible text editor, right? Or we need to go and do these bits of orchestration. I don't like to use Puppet and Chef and these other things and a bunch of VMware. I'm going to go do my own thing. I'll make Docker, right? So people do these things because they're solving problems that are fairly well defined. But in the Python and the PyData SciPy world, this has actually been a little bit different. The open source here was built to scratch itches, not of software devs, but of postdocs, of assistant professors, of researchers. And they're actually having to do it because they can't get CS people to solve their problems for them, right? That's actually a really interesting thing, because over here, this is solving well-known problems. And in both cases, people are scratching their own itch. But in both cases, there's a different motivation. A lot of times here, it's for the, look at what I did, I can brag about it on Hacker News. And over here, it's like, crap, I gotta get my work done. And also, it's kind of really cool, it's a lot of fun, right? And there's maybe a cool community that's starting to form around it, and I'll do it. But in the 90s and the 2000s, a lot of the stuff grew up around this. It's like, for us we don't have access to a large, giant pool of developers. We have to do it ourselves. And thanks to Python and thanks to some of the design decisions there and the early groundwork laid in that ecosystem, we can go and do these things. And that's really awesome. So I think it's really important. All of that is to say that when we talk about open source, we should be very, very intentional in distinguishing between open source for commoditization versus open source for innovation. So classic infrastructure open source stuff tends to solve these well-known problems, but these numerical ones are solving advanced problems that seems like nobody in the world cares about until they give rise to like machine learning and AI, which everyone all of a sudden cares about. And in both cases, though, open source facilitates an open marketplace. So the cost of maintenance, you can trade that off against the upside, the risk of future innovation. And what I mean by that, that's kind of a lot to unpack in that sentence. But if you have a thing that works, you can go and say, well, this works. If I don't make many changes to it, it'll continue working. But for me to do this other really cool feature, I'm going to make a bunch of changes to it. So a very classic example is a matplotlib, right? You can't do interactive matplotlib through the browser. Although there have been tools to do that. People have thrown little things out there. But to really do it as well as Bokeh or Plotly requires a deep refactor of matplotlib. Now, if you're poor Thomas, and Thomas Caswell, who's the maintainer there, do you want to break millions of people's code and possibly get there before everyone just uses whatever Tableau, Looker, Amazon charting service? Or do you just say, well, let's just not break the world and let's have everyone's stuff still work, right? That's a trade-off every single software dev of every library always has to make all the time. And in this case, you can actually have an honest trade-off. You can actually have other people in the community say, we'll maintain these bits, we want this stuff, we want to refactor this, we'll put our time in to do this, or someone else is going to do a crazy year-long thing and come around and say, hey, look what I did. And actually, I did it for you already, right? So there's a really cool marketplace around that. And that gets to this network intelligence to kind of explore the possibility space. It's a really cool thing. So the PyData and the SciPy innovation community, I would say, and this is what I was saying in my keynote earlier, the thing that's so different about us, the thing that's so different about this community that's wonderful to keep in mind, is that it's been pursuing the art of the possible for 20 years, and it's been doing it with basically minimal resources, minimal volunteer resources. It has pursued the art of the possible, and all of the successful projects that I've seen blossom in this space have a few defining characteristics that it's made them play well with each other. Having reasonable leadership is a really important thing. Playing well with others. We have to deliver actual value quickly, and we have to sort of limit the scope a little bit so it can plug into other things. What we don't do here is invent the world, hijack other projects' users, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? These are actual things that people care about when we talk about, hey, is this a good project? How is this project doing with these other, relative to these other ones? And I would say that this collaborative community has out-innovated and better leveraged human labor than capitalism, by far. The example I like to give is that, not anymore, but as of like, a few years ago, I could have fit the entire maintainer community of NumPy, SciPy, and Pandas, well, NumPy and SciPy, at least, to Matplotlib, into my minivan. It'd be a little tight, but I could fit them in my minivan. And if we strap West to the top of it, then we get Pandas as well. And that would be basically billions of dollars of value that's being added to the global economy every day in a minivan. I cannot think of a single other instance where we have that kind of leverage of human labor and human knowledge. There are a few lone geniuses, the famous JFK quote about Thomas Jefferson dining alone. All that kind of grandstanding aside, actual concrete getting stuff shipped that people use that does MRI processing, looks at the burning of the Amazon, puts rockets up in space, all these other kinds of things. Like the actual amount of trading, the amount of stuff that happens on the software infrastructure being delivered by that minivan full of Homo sapien mass. This innovation community has done this far better than any other mechanism, far better than any other organizing principle. That's the thing we need to preserve and understand. Oh yeah, awesome, right? So what do businesses value in open source though? So we've done this, but what do they value in it? It's not actually about the cost of software. The truth is, for most businesses, the cost of software is small relative to the cost of the people, relative to business risk and innovation risk and all these other kinds of things. And so what they really, really care about, that I've come to understand, is they want to avoid lock-in. They want to be able to harness innovation, but they want to be able to have control over their own destiny about when they adopt certain things, what's going to happen. Everyone wants control, right? It's true of individuals. It's true of large organizations. But what does the open source community value? A whole different set of things, right? It's a gift economy. It's a sharing economy, right? If you show up in, you go to SciPy next summer, and you give a talk, and you're like, here's a pile of code I've been working on for 10 years in isolation, and it's awesome. People are going to be like, wow, you should have released that a little bit earlier, because this thing, that thing, the other thing, no single person is smarter than all the other people, right? So participating, having pride in what you do, so shipping a bunch of crap is not good, but you want to participate. You want to be vulnerable and say, well, this is not perfect yet, but here's our ideas, and here's some cool stuff. And in a sense, the software artifact is almost a byproduct. At some point, the stable running development community is the important thing. Now, it is the utility for the end users. At the end of the day, someone's got to be able to, Conda install a package and have it work. But really, what's really valuable is having this stability and predictability, efficiency in the development process itself. Be able to maintain stuff, ship stuff, and still be open to innovation. Really, really hard. So I think as open source communities mature, the important thing is not just can they play the song, can you put your finger on the right places on the fingerboard to play the notes, but how well all these instruments play well, how well they play together is really, really important. That's almost as important as the music itself. If we're to zero out the repositories for all of the major, all the NumFOCUS projects, we're to zero them out. I bet that we could rebuild in some period of time. It would take time to rebuild it, but just with those same people who are the maintainers, they could rebuild high quality stuff in a shockingly short amount of time. But if you were to give that same task of rebuild the entire NumFOCUS PyData stack to any other group of developers, I don't care how wealthy you are, I don't care if you're the most wealthiest company in the world, a Facebook or Google or Microsoft who's great at shipping software, I don't think you could deliver the same kind of thing that this community can deliver. That has the same properties of being well-maintained, open to innovation, and well-maintained in the future. Like that is a really, really amazing thing, actually, that a volunteer community orchestra becomes the best orchestra in the world. That's amazing, actually. But what they both miss is that software isn't code. Software is a relationship, all right? It's your code solving someone else's problem. And there's a lot of words here. I'll give people a chance to read it, my wall of text. So I think that if we're to talk about software communities, the emphasis should be on community as opposed to the software. The software is the ancillary thing that this community produces, but really the important thing is the community that produces that software. So the way I would talk about it is like a river. So the river is more than any drop of water. You cannot take a teaspoon and scoop a little teaspoon of the Mississippi and say, I've got the Mississippi, right? The Mississippi is this thing. It's actually a particular flow through the landscape. If the entire Mississippi, if you got rid of every drop of water and it started raining again at the fountainhead, you'd get the Mississippi back. And so this idea that we have a community of practitioners, of thinkers, of innovators, of coders, of users actually, power users, they all define a landscape of possibilities. And so this idea that everyone in the business world, thanks to Bill Gates, they value software as an artifact. That artifact just a little cup of water out of a river. The river is actually much more fundamental. And the river is there because of this flow. And so this process view and a people-oriented view of software communities is really the way I've come around to thinking about this stuff. And the way the community flows, how does the Mississippi grow and change? If you've seen really cool time-lapse videos of how the river deltas and estuaries change over time, it's beautiful. It's just an absolutely amazing thing to see. We have the same thing here happening in the world of software, that essentially these communities explore alternative, little rivulets turn into streams, turn into the future of the river. And that's really the right way to think about the communities and how we explore possibility space. So when we look at the health of a community, you can look at GitHub stars, you can look at number of commits per day and all this other stuff, but really I think the measures are more thermodynamic and more physical in nature based on these processes. The other thing is that open source software, again to my dings on Bill Gates, who's a very smart guy, but he really, I don't know how many people here ever read, how many of you read his letter to hobbyists back in like the 70s? Anyone? Yeah. So back in the day, people did not treat software as a thing. It was because the hardware, the computer, was the super valuable thing. The software was like an instruction manual tucked in the glove compartment. It's like, it's kind of cool, but who cares? Bill Gates saw the PC revolution coming, and people were starting to pirate. They were just copying code all over the place. And he's like, whoa, hold on. So he wrote a letter. It's called the letter, if you want to Google it, it's the letter to hobbyists from Bill Gates. He wrote an angry little letter saying, look, if y'all just keep copying our software, then we won't be able to be a viable business. And this whole industry, like basically he conceived of the software industry by calling software property, by drawing a line in the sand and saying, those bits on that floppy disk or on that tape, those bits are my bits. And if you take them, you need to pay me again for my bits. But the fact of the matter is, philosophically, metaphysically, software is unproperty. There is no metaphysical basis to define software as property. You can actually go and look at, this is one example, usufruct is one aspect that people attribute to what property ownership means. It's the use of the deriving utility, deriving value from the use of a thing, but many other things, the right to destroy, the right to mutate, all these are other properties of, they're aspects of what we call property rights. Almost none of them pertain to software. So software is unproperty, and thus, it's intrinsically anti-rivalrous. That means if you go and use software and I use the same software, there's no conflict. If you eat a banana, I can't eat that banana. If you build a house and a gorgeous view, I can't build a house in the same place without blocking your view, right? But software is intrinsically anti-rivalrous, and that confuses the out of most economic engines, because economics is all about scarcity. And so the last 30 years has been about how do we couple the engines and our reasoning about scarce economic models to an intrinsically anti-rivalrous, unproperty thing. And that's done through software licensing. It's done through, I'll give you a heart-wrenching story. Yesterday, actually, I got back to my house after being here in the morning, and my daughter, I walked in, and my wife was in the shower or something like that. My daughter was on the tablet, and there's this little paint by numbers app she's been using. And we don't pay for it, so it's a little adware thing. But one of the things is they give you these little color bombs. So you take the color bomb and you splash it, and it just automatically colors a bunch of the picture. It's super cool. But there's only like 2 color bombs available, and you have to pay for the app to get more. And my daughter accidentally tapped it with her thumb, and she was crying because she used one of her 2 color bombs. Now, how many people here know how to code that color bomb thing? And how many of you know what it would take, how much more effort and sweat it would take to take that one color bomb and make it a million or infinite number of color bombs, right? Software is infinite. The things we can do with software is so amazingly powerful, and yet at every single step of the way, we've gated it, we've checkpointed it, we've limited it, we've made it finite and scarce, we've made little 5-year-olds cry on a Saturday morning because we got to get our dollar. That's the amazing thing. And what the reason why the PyData, the open source community, has been able to out-compete, out-innovate so many other large masses of people is that sharing increases value. In generative economies and generative dynamics, sharing increases value. You ever imagine going to a book club or reading circle, and saying, well, I read the book. I'm not going to tell you my idea unless you tell me yours. I'll rate your idea on a scale of 1 to 10, and I'll only give you my ideas that are within 5% of your idea. That's crap. We go to a reading club because we share ideas with each other because we get better. We love hearing other people's ideas. That's the idea of sharing increasing value. So we're sort of peak P. Wang here because I'm quoting my own tweets, okay? So, but this is a pinned tweet for a while for me, which is that Conway's law, how many people here are familiar with Conway's law? A few people? Conway's law said that he was a consultant who studied software systems. He was hired to study some software projects back in like the 70s or 80s. And he coined this law that said that based on what he saw, the architecture of a piece of software resembles the communication architecture of the organization that produced it. So if you build a piece of software and you say, well, I have this, so I'm going to hire a group to do this, another group works on this part of the project, another group works on this, the software will be architected in a tripartite way. If you have 5 groups, 5 teams that do different things, your software architecture solving the same problem will have 5 components to it. So software, the architecture of the software mirrors the information architecture or the information communication patterns of the people that develop it. And so the flip of that then, DJ Microbeads, whoever he or she is, said that, look, if software systems mimic the organizational structure of organizations, then innovations in software must come from new organizational structures. Boom, so obvious, and yet so incredibly deep. Because it means that if we want software to stop being broken, we must stop having broken organizations that build that software. Right? Code is a cultural artifact. And the culture of this community that has produced these amazing code innovations, that's the thing we must preserve. Not how to relicense some of this crap so that it can go in the cloud and someone doesn't, partition it off and all this other stuff. It's how do we defend the culture that produced the stuff. So that's my last part of my talk, is the community itself. So Clay Shirky wrote a book called Here Comes Everybody, where he talks about crowdsourcing. And a number of different things in the world, of course, that are crowdsourced. We all know them, Wikipedia, things like that. Kickstarter, in a sense, is kind of an Indiegogo. These are crowdsourcing a little bit. And the first thing, he says there's 4 stages of collaboration. The first one is what he calls me first collaboration. And I won't get into the details of all this other stuff, but I'll just lay out the 4 bits here, I think, in the interest of time. Yeah. And the part here is that you got to build something that kind of works for yourself. Then you got to actually have a place where people can come together and talk to you about it and learn about it. And then you actually have collaboration, where groups actually come together with a shared purpose. And what's really fascinating about this is that he did not write this as a lecture on open source software, but he did actually call this that it's often characterized by people wanting to fix a market failure. Because the reason that we oftentimes collaborate is because markets have failed to actually solve the problem. So we work together to overcome the market failure. Markets represent a packaging of solutions to maybe a previous understanding of the problem, not what the new understanding is available, not what new understanding is available. And then at the very end, and he says most groups do not get to this. At the very end, you have collective action, which is when the group actually cares about the group itself. The fate of the group as a whole becomes important. This is just a bunch of people adding stuff to Wikipedia because we don't all want to pay for Encarta online. This is the Wikipedia editors coming together and having a conference every year, twice a year, saying how do we make Wikipedia better? How do we defend the values of Wikipedia, right? Most people don't get to this point. And a really important part of this is that there's a difference between participation and labor. They're different. When you go and you do some stuff and you get paid for it, that's labor. And obviously, if you're not an indentured servant or a slave, you volunteered into that labor. It was a voluntary exchange of your labor for dollars or some kind of remuneration. But participation is actually kind of different. Participatory cultural activity, it gives you a voice and it preserves your agency, right? And this is kind of when you're a contractor, right? The legal definition of like a 1099 contractor is that they're told what to do but not how to do it, right? So I need that siding fixed. I need this deck built. Get a contractor in. I need this website built. Get a contractor in. You're not going to go and stand over their shoulder and tell them how they need to do it. They're doing it. But that's also not participation. It's just an example of even in labor law, we separate and we put some bounds around when people have voice and when people have agency over how something is done. So when you accept other people into this participation culture, you have to have trust with them. So cultures and communities arise, communities of collaboration arise when trust can develop between people. And then now we're all participating in a trustful way. All of you attending this conference, you're participating, right? How many of you are here because your employer said you must attend or we're going to fire you? Anybody? I'll talk to your boss if they told you. Right. So there is some element of participation here because you care about this stuff. That's participation. And it's not absolute. Just like the openness, it's not binary, 0, 1, open, closed. Participation of labor, we're all sort of in the middle. And people talk about effective labor and versus anomie, where it's just labor. I mean, even on the labor side, there's a lot of stuff. And participation, likewise, there's many different types of participation. All of you here are participating, although obviously you hope to learn things that then apply to your job. So it's a mix of these things. But ultimately, for a collaborative culture, for collaboration culture to turn into this participatory mode, you have to have a way for people to develop trust with each other. And I think a challenge that people have today, and we see this in different, I see different shades of this manifesting in our ecosystem and in our conversations, it's really hard to trust corporations and brands. They're not vulnerable. They have entire large PR departments to make sure that there's no chink in the armor. They're not vulnerable. Brands are there for you to consume. Brands are there for you to consume their stories about themselves. If you start developing a story about them on Twitter, they will come in and engage with you to change that story, right? Brands are there to be consumed, not to invite participation, invite trust. And that's why people don't trust corporate participation in these kinds of things. So trust still, we're hairless primates, a few 100,000 years off the savannah, we still tie trust to viewing each other, to spending time with each other, bumping elbows, hugging, right? Just breaking bread with each other. Trust is still tied to individuals. So I think what we have here, the best model I can think of for the PyData community and the SciPy PyData, actually Python community in general, is that of a community garden. And people have put a lot of labor into it, but they've all participated in tending the garden. And for a long time, we've had this honor box where here's a bunch of free fruit. You don't have to come water it. You don't have to weed. We come in and we do it because we love gardening. But here's some free fruit. Enjoy. And I think companies like Anaconda and Quanside, we try to be like the community cooperative little farm store on the side of the farm. We understand how important it is to till the soil and to water the plants and all these things. And we try to have an easier way to buy, an easier way to participate for all the other participants out there. But what is not appreciated, or what is not, when corporate players show up, they don't understand the magic that made this garden grow. They don't need to reason about it because they say, well, there's free fruit. And the corporate model is one of very direct linear models that fit on spreadsheets, right? So if this much water, this much nitrogen, this much oxygen, and this much sunlight led to this much fruit, we're going to back up and we're going to pave a highway to it, back up our industrial farming equipment, build greenhouses, put this much stuff in, pump it all in, and we'll have 10 times the amount of fruit, right? And that's not actually how it works. So that's the education I'm trying to impart to all of those folks. They don't, again, they're not trying to destroy it. It's just their models of thinking about this doesn't work. And the reason, and this is the crux, this is the golden heart of this talk, is that all of us, I would say looking around here, most of us come from a Western tradition of thinking, which in Western modernity is very focused on talking about goals, goal-oriented thinking. How many of you have ever been told to succeed in life, you must set good goals, concrete goals, and work towards them? I don't disagree with that. That's clearly true. If we have no goals, we wander around aimlessly, right? So having goals is good. But what's completely missed in the conversation, we do not stress this into people, is that it is just as important to live your values. And here's the really interesting thing. Every single activity, every single object that you contemplate, every relationship you engage in can be viewed from both of these dimensions, both of these aspects. If I have a car, I can say this car is a means, it's a vehicle, literally a vehicle, for me to get to the airport, for me to get to the grocery store, for me to get to school, to get to work. It's an object. It helps me achieve my goals. Actually, in goal-oriented thinking, we tend to objectify other people, processes, and actual objects. But I can also look at the car as a different thing. I say, wow, this car is a much better car than I had before. This car, or this car is an electric car, and now I'm living my values of environmentalism, right? Or this car is a secondhand car. I'm buying used cars because I have a value of frugality, right? Or this car is a brand shiny new Beamer because my value is that I really love money. And you laugh. This is why people call Wall Street soulless, is because this is a place that's completely goal-oriented, and the only value is to achieve numerical goals. Those of us who work close to Wall Street, have been there, or know people who have been in that orbit, you know the type, right? There are people, there's a reason why the New York finance scene changes you, is because it basically atrophies this part of your humanity. When we look at other people, I mean, I have many of my employees here in the room, and I can say, well, these people, I have a goal-oriented approach to them, right? They have different job functions, and that's all great. But it's extremely important, it is really bad for us to view other people in a way that's blind to values, to shared values and living shared values. So the reason these are up here is because my friend Joe Edelman runs a thing called the Human Systems Institute in Berlin, and they talk explicitly about this. And he has a much better articulation of this principle, that in life, we have just, in the Western world in particular, and in modernity, we have just way overemphasized one arm, which is the goal-oriented thinking, and we've completely de-emphasized the value-based thinking. And the reason why this is important is because for the PyData community, the thing that's differentiated about it is not how much faster we can ship software, or how much better we've leveraged human labor versus capitalism. It's actually the values are different. There are special values in this community that have driven us this far. By living our values, this community has actually outperformed. Not by pushing harder on goals. I mean, if you go around and you ask all the NumFOCUS project leaders, what are your KPIs? How well is your team doing on the KPIs? Let's build a big old Gantt chart and look at how you're shipping. They'll be like, ugh, I don't know, man. You know, but so-and-so just had a baby, and so we're taking some time off so they can go and take care of their kid, right? Like that, the values we've lived have managed to achieve goals better than if we were just strict goal-oriented. That particular dynamic is the thing we need to preserve. Now, that being said, we have to be very intentional in thinking about this. In the world that's coming, where cloud is pervasive, sensors are everywhere, scary ML and AI models are going to be turned on by people who have no idea what they mean to go and make all sorts of decisions. We can bang our fists on the table all we want to about bias and about all this other stuff. It doesn't matter. Most of the world is numerically illiterate, and they will just believe what the machine in the black box tells them. They already do that. They already do that with Excel, right? People talk about explainability in AI. I want explainability in Excel first, right? And so this idea that that if we don't lean in and actually drive and extend the values of this community, then we're just going to be eclipsed by more goal-oriented thinking, by, hey, how much more open source software can we ship? And you already see it a little bit, like when you look at GitHub metrics. There's not a ding on GitHub. I'm just sort of talking about this mentality of goal versus value thinking. When you look at GitHub, and many people do, they go to GitHub to look at the health of a project. Nowhere in that discussion is it, does the project have a value statement? How well do they live their values? Can you imagine how insane that would be if you went onto the GitHub tracker for like any of these projects, go to like npm.js and say, what are the values of this project? Who wants to do that? Anyone? I'll do it. It'd be interesting. But what you'll find is a bunch of geeks like, what the fuck do you mean values? Like, yeah, we want to be cool. We want to do good work for our users. I mean, they might even get to, here's the values. We want to do good work for our users. We want to have maintainable service and all this stuff. Let's say you're not living those values very well. But at the end of the day, if projects don't, I always slip in a JavaScript ding in all my talks. Yeah. But the idea here is that these projects, we look at things like number of downloads, number of commits, release cadence, number of developers, and all these other kinds of things. And it's great to have like diversity metrics, right? How many new people are they onboarding, underrepresented folks, and all these other kinds of things. That's all great, but those are all like, that's very goal-oriented approaches to what should be adding values and values of inclusion, values of these, values of service. Those are the kinds of values that have actually moved this community really, really far. And if we don't defend those values and we get fixated and wrapped around goals, we're going to get eaten alive and steamrollered by these big corporate players who have a completely different set of values. And that's what colonization feels like, by the way, is when someone else with different values comes in, and you may have the same buildings, you may eat the same foods, have the same holidays, but you're colonized because your values are now different. And that's the problem that I see. That's the conflict, is the value conflict between this open source community and the corporate players. So for us to, when we talk about, who was it that, was it Lily? Who had the question about project leadership and governance. So I talked about crossing the chasm in my previous talk. So when we're talking to products, crossing the chasm is frequently talked about as go-to-market. So those of you who are in the business world are probably familiar with this term. We built this product, now what's our go-to-market? How do we sell it? How do we package it? How do we talk about it? And all these other things. But for projects, that equivalent concept is go-to community. And so to do that, in the early adopter stage, it's about the tech. But to cross the chasm, it should be about your values. And that's, sorry for a very long-winded answer to your question from an hour ago. But that's the answer, is that project leadership and governance in the early stages should be about the tech, because that's how you make yourself differentiated in the world. In a sense, it is kind of a value. The technical values will always be there. We want certain kinds of technical excellence. We want certain kinds of innovation and be open to innovation, things like that. But as you cross into this other market, the values should dominate the conversation. Eleanor Ostrom is probably the most storied thinker and the most august thinker in this space about commons. And in most of the studies that she did, whether it was like Swiss sheep farmers and pastures that were commons, all of her studies around commons and communities and things like that, they tended to be around commons of scarce resources in the physical world, because the physical world fundamentally is rivalrous and scarce. And so it's about defending a scarce resource from rivalrous depletion, right? If all of us just get our sheep to go eat as much grass as possible, then all of us are actually hosed, versus if we actually establish a pattern, right? But innovation and creation are not rivalrous. So what is the commons that needs defending, right? Because I already said, software, if I use software, if I take an open source repo, I can go do whatever I want to with it. How is that stopping you from doing anything? There's no rivalrous there. I'm not taking anything from you. You can go and make code too. You can make a new version of it. I can make a new version of it. Why, is there a thing there that needs defending as a commons? And there is. And actually what it is the attention and the time of the developers. Because if every single one of us goes and forks SciPy, we've hurt all of us. Because there's only so many developers out there who could use the next version of SciPy. And now they're going to spend their time either in analysis paralysis land, or they're going to say, screw all this, I'll just stick with MATLAB, right? Or whatever. But all of us actually competing for the future, there is a cost to it. It's not free. We can't innovate for free. Because if we want our innovation to get adopted, we're competing for a rivalrous resource, which is the time and attention of developers, of the developer community. And in this way, this is the danger of the faux open source sort of stuff from the cloud vendors. They're colonizing that commons. They're taking it wholesale. So when I talk about open source software and the open source software community, it's about what is open. Openness is embodied in the lived values of the community. That's the important thing. And those values need defending. Those values will not be defended by big corporate players. I'm going to try my damnedest over the next several years to give condensed versions of this talk for business heads, but basically to convince them that they cannot colonize, right? They need to actually work well with and show up as part of the community, participate and share the values. But at the same time, the community itself needs to start building antigens and building some defensive awareness of the dynamic that's happening. These values will not defend themselves. You must all defend them. That's my talk.